Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel delighted in welcoming all the participants to the CERCA monthly lecture series, which is a new initiative that CERCA has started very recently. We are very fortunate to have with us Professor Kalpana Balakrishnan, who is a renowned air pollution epidemiologist in this country. Welcome, Dr. Kalpana, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to speak. Let me now invite our respected founder, Mr. Arun Dugal. I would request him to welcome Dr. Kalpana and also share his few words about CERCA. Mr. Arun Dugal, sir, please, over to you.
Thank you, Hemant. I don't know if I'm visible and audible. Am I?
You are.
Okay, thank you. I add my warm welcome to all of you to the first CERCA lecture series on air pollution. I'm so grateful to Professor Kalpana Balakrishnan to deliver this inaugural address. A few words about CERCA. It was formed, Center of Excellence for Research in Clean Air. CERCA was formed at IIT Delhi just about 3 years ago. And the objective of this organization is to provide science-based inputs on air pollution issues to policymakers in India. We have recently expanded its scope to include climate change. Through CERCA series of lectures, we expect to increase public awareness of air pollution issues, which have tremendous impact on health, particularly on the health of children, the elderly, and the economically weaker section of society. We expect to have these lectures delivered by scientists, hopefully on a monthly basis, and increase public awareness, including awareness of younger people in schools and colleges and in all walks of life, so that there is not only awareness, but there is also a strong interest to take steps to improve air quality. May I now request Professor Sagnik to introduce Professor Balakrishnan. Professor Sagnik.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for your opening remarks. So it has been a great pleasure to introduce Professor Kalpana Balakrishnan, who has been a mentor to me. So Professor Balakrishnan is very well-known name in the air pollution community. In fact, she does not need any introduction, but I will very quickly try to introduce her accomplishments. Professor Kalpana Balakrishnan is Associate Dean Research at Sri Ramchandra University, Chennai, and Director of the WHO Collaborative Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, and also the Director of ICMR Center for Advanced Research on Air Quality, Climate and Health at the same university. She did her undergraduate education at AIIMS Delhi and then subsequently did her Ph.D. and postdoc at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. Her primary research focuses on air pollution and health and chemical risk assessment. She is actively involved in multiple national and international programs, and to name a few, the Global Burden of Disease Study, WHO Air Quality Guideline Formulation, the International Agency for Research on Cancer Monographs, the Global Energy Assessments, UNEP Asia Pacific Regional Assessments, and most recently the India State Level Disease Burn Initiative, where she led the air pollution up. She published more than 150 peer-reviewed articles with a very high H index. She is a member of the National Steering Committee on Air Pollution-related issues for health effects under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, and the ICMR-led task force for assessment of impact of initiatives to promote clean household energy in India. She won numerous awards for her scientific contributions. She was awarded Hariom Ashram Trust Award for Outstanding Scientist in area of interaction between science and policy by the UGC in 2000. She won the Distinguished Scientist Award for contributions to the field by an Indian public health scientist in the area of environmental health sciences by Public Health Foundation of India. She was also elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Medical Sciences India in 2014. So with this brief introduction, it's again a great pleasure to invite Professor Balakrishnan for our inaugural CERCA seminar. Over to you, ma'am.
Dr. Sagnik, Dr. Kaushal, Dugal sir, namaskar. It's a great privilege and honor to receive your invitation to deliver this lecture. From what I understand, today is the first of the series of lectures that CERCA is launching. And I hope I do justice to the honor that you have given me to launch off this series of lecture. First of all, let me express my extreme, delight, or I'm extraordinarily delighted that Sagnik is, one of my very esteemed collaborators, and although he likes to call himself my student, I view him as my colleague and now my teacher as well in the area of, so many new things that he and his group have led, along with many other colleagues in IIT Delhi and the IIT network and the national network. I think, the issue that we are currently trying to address begs the kind of center activities that you're all launching. It is very much the need of hour. It requires, frequent scientific dialogues that are objective, that are sensitive to the needs and the variability of the requirements of a wide section of our society. Dugal Saab mentioned students, public citizens, and also sometimes we as scientists sort of really don't think very much about, communicating beyond our high impact peer-reviewed journals. And of course, the younger generation is getting much more into this. But it really is required that we communicate our science, concurrently as it evolves, and not wait until a huge body of knowledge is accumulated, and then we have a very hard time roping in that community of stakeholders that we want. And this is especially critical, I think, because the time for action is now on air pollution. And therefore, what I wish to do today is to share some insights from my 25-year journey here in India. Sagnik mentioned that I came to India after completing my graduate studies in the US. Very, naive in my thinking that, I can actually examine air pollution in a laboratory context and sort of really parse my head around what health effects it might lead to. 25 years of engagement has taught me that air pollution and action on air pollution is anything but the lab, and the entire communities that we are dealing with provide us an opportunity to examine various dimensions of air pollution: sources, emissions, exposures, biological effects, health impacts, economic impacts, and so forth. But yet, by closing our eyes to this laboratory that we are constantly need to work in, and limiting our scope of examination to any one of these dimensions, if you're not looking at sources, but you want to look at health effects, if you're not looking at health effects and you want to look at emissions, doesn't really put you in a vantage point. And therefore, no one group of researchers can really address this challenge for India. And therefore, this networking that your center is accomplishing and aims to establish through a continuous series of such scientific discourses is such an important part of it. So if you would kindly indulge me over the next half an hour, I will share some of my reflections. I totally recognize that it's a very diverse group of audience members who might be listening in. I certainly don't want to overwhelm anyone with too much scientific detail. I am happy to be in touch with anyone who wants to get in touch with me or, Sagnik, since we are so closely working together to provide additional information on any aspect that you might find interesting. So if I may go ahead and share my screen, just give me a moment. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. So when Sagnik asked me to, title the talk, I was just thinking about something that one of our chief pulmonologists was talking about. Lungs, all you've got is a pair. And if you want to keep your body healthy, breathing clean air is a primary prerequisite. And this does not require any rocket scientific logical explanation. All of us recognize that we need clean air, water, and land to live a healthy life. But I think what is lost on us is that just that little pair of lungs is our entry point and a constant entry point. You can't stop breathing. And therefore, you need to ensure that every breath brings in air that is healthy. And you can just recognize the sheer challenge of this. And you normally have a perception that if you are in a, high-end metropolitan city, your environment can be quite, clean or dirty, depending on where in that high-end metropolitan city you end up spending your time in. If you live in an air-conditioned house, commute in an air-conditioned car, work in air-conditioned office, before COVID, if you were still walking around with masks, perhaps you can be thinking that your air was relatively clean. Even that doesn't seem to be the case in India. But you can imagine an average citizen like you and everybody else, like me and everybody else who's listening in, who, for the life of us, wouldn't want to spend our lives in just air-conditioned spaces between offices and homes. We would love to get out there and live our lives. But if every single one of those environments for every single one of us, and that's 1.4 billion of us, young and old and rural and urban, spending times indoors and outdoors, where to always have clean air, that's a pretty challenging task, because you can recognize that you can have clean air some of the time, in some places, but the challenge of creating healthy breathing spaces in India is compounded, multifold by our very large population. So you have to recognize that it's not okay for us to be thinking about one state or even multiple states or even a region to be clean. We need to be looking at the entire country with 1.4 billion people. And it's not just urban that we are talking about. Our regulatory attention is focused entirely on the urban ambient microenvironment. But one has to recognize just waiting to be regulated and just waiting to be addressed is the indoor, or in fact, the outdoor rural ambient environment that is at huge exposure risks from underdevelopment, so to say, from the use of dirty sources of household energy, such as biomass or dung or agricultural residues and coal and so forth. So the challenge of creating healthy breathing spaces and the challenge of unhealthy breathing spaces is an everyday reality for all of us. Whether it is the regulators who are trying to create this, or the people and the scientists who are trying to address this through scientific evidence, or the common everyday person who is just trying to breathe. It is not something that we have been able to sort of really put a dimension on until very recently. So one has to think about, how could we even begin to understand the magnitude of how unhealthy is our air. And if you looked at the pictures that I showed in my previous slide, you would have seen rural environments, indoor environments, urban environments, traffic environments, industry environments, agricultural waste burning environments, agricultural burning environments, and small and medium enterprise environments, and large occupational environments. Air pollution is present everywhere, doesn't require many of us to be told about that. But it was not until very recently, the year 2017 to be precise, that a whole network of scientists came together, worked for over 2.5 years or 3 years to become a part of what is called as the Global Burden of Disease Initiative, to parse out the India state level disease burden initiative, to sort of get a refined feel of what exactly are the exposures across states in India in the ambient environment, now labeled as PM 2.5, but one has to recognize that PM 2.5 as a pollutant is just one indicator of the large cocktail of pollutants that the ambient environment exposes us to. So for the purposes of this particular talk, if we assume that PM 2.5 or particulate matter, fine particulate matter, less than 2.5 microns in diameter is our indicator pollutant, we recognize just from the map that there is a great level of heterogeneity in the exposures to ambient air pollution. You can recognize that states such as Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and the Delhi NCR region is upwards of 100, while states such as Tamil Nadu are somewhere in the range of 20 to 40 micrograms per meter cube, with Kerala reporting some of the lowest levels in 2017. This map looks simple enough, but to be able to come up with an exposure metric that adequately conveys health risks for the entire population that is attributable to ambient concentrations was not an easy task. It was not possible to do this exercise from routinely collected data from the CPCB or the State Pollution Control Board monitoring station data alone. It required a complex interface between ground level monitoring data, chemical transport model data, emissions inventory data, as well as satellite-based ground truth AOD data that Sagnik and his team have been very elegantly leading for the last many years, together with many other kinds of refinements to get to this state-level gradient profiling for exposures. On a similar front, it was not sufficient for us to think of only the ambient exposures. It was necessary to think of exposures attributable to household sources, labeled here as household air pollution. And the index there, popularly used, is not a concentration of PM 2.5, but a percent population that is dependent on solid fuels. So clearly you can recognize that we need to translate the proportion of the population using solid fuels into some unit concentration of PM 2.5 to be able to relate the health risks that are attributable to ambient air pollution and household air pollution associated with the use of household fuels. And this was an exercise, I'm very proud to say, was led by our group in close association with many others, including Sagnik and his colleagues, to sort of look at what exactly is the household air pollution exposures that can be attributed to, that can be used to attribute health risks to. So the 2 points that I wanted to share from this slide is that the burden of air pollution exposures in India is so high, shown our data from 2017, but no matter which iteration of this exercise you look at, go back 5 years, go forward 5 years now in 2021, 4 years, you will see that nearly 99% of India's population is exposed to concentrations that are well in excess of the WHO guideline value of 10 micrograms per meter cube of PM 2.5. Nowhere in India can you actually find these concentrations over an annual average period. Perhaps in a few spots, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer that Sagnik might be able to tell you on, but very rarely can you find such healthy breathing spaces for anyone in India. So clearly, everybody is at some risk. And therefore, even if it's a very small risk, multiply that by 1.4 billion, it has to be a big number. It can't be a small number when you have such a large population exposed to levels that are much greater than the WHO air quality guidelines, which are health-based guidelines. So how big is this number? The number that we published in 2017 was about 1.24 million deaths attributable to air pollution, with some 0.67 million attributable to ambient particulate air pollution or PM 2.5, as I was mentioning, and some 0.5 million to household air pollution or the use of domestic solid fuels. And you can recognize with considerable heterogeneity across states, the low socio-demographic index states end up bearing some of the highest burden. But you can also appreciate that as much as the high is slightly better than the low, pretty much all of India is at considerable health risks from exposures to air pollution. And as policymakers who are receiving these numbers, it is not an easy task to sort of recognize, what are we, where did these numbers come from? How representative are these numbers and these modeling methods and these modeling exercises of populations in India? How do we look at these changing numbers every year? And most importantly, when this number is as big as what is attributable to traditional risk factors like smoking, alcohol, cholesterol, salt, you sort of, start doubting these numbers. We recognize tobacco, we recognize alcohol, we recognize cholesterol and salt, but surely we are not dropping dead like the way we would or imagine we would from tobacco or from alcohol, because that perception of air pollution is a very innocuous one. So one has to recognize that the total burden doesn't come from the risks alone. The risks to an individual may be much greater than from what is coming from tobacco. But when you have small risks multiplied by huge number of people who are exposed to, it should not be surprising that this number is as large as what it is. And thus came the new framing. air pollution was coined as the new tobacco by the Director General of WHO in the year 2019. And this is because many of the disease endpoints that we have long known from tobacco use are the same endpoints that are being impacted by air pollution: household air pollution and ambient air pollution. It is not surprising at all that it is the case, because after all, what we are dealing with, the cigarette is as toxic as air pollution or vice versa. Cigarette is also addictive. Thank God, air pollution is not addictive. We still love clean air. We don't yearn for dirty air. Our lungs are quite smart to sort of yearn for clean air all the time. But tobacco, essentially the risk from tobacco are one, addiction, but two, products of incomplete combustion. Any product of incomplete combustion that results from tobacco use, very closely proximal to the breathing spaces, you inhale it, and you inhale it deeply in order to achieve maximum deposition of the addictive agent. The poor woman in the kitchen, whose job it is to get her chula going, also wants to deep breathe, take deep breaths to make sure that she gets as much air, into the chula to get the smoke started up. That act alone puts her so much at risk that it mirrors the equivalent of many cigarette breaths that the woman is unconsciously inhaling. So when air pollution impacts were quantified and put in relation to tobacco, this should open our eyes. We fight the tobacco war, not just by addressing the tobacco companies alone. We have to fight the war by looking at what really contributes to those behaviors that are responsible for those exposures, what disease conditions that are already present in the community can predispose you to increased risk from tobacco, and what kind of interventions can you really design, sustain, monitor to evaluate the efficacy of reduced mortality and morbidity. We started doing that for tobacco some 50 years ago, more like 100 years ago. The war on tobacco is far from won. So therefore, recognizing health risks for air pollution to be as big as tobacco is the first step for convincing ourselves that we need to wage a war similar to what we did some 100 years ago for other risks, including drinking water and sanitation, tobacco, cholesterol, salt, and the likes. When you look at this number that I presented to you, 1.24 million deaths, and when you have a global group of scientists that we are all proud to be part of, but Sagnik and I are in an unenviable position of often having to explain the global results to the national stakeholders, because after all, India is one contributor to the global models, and we refine India models. And I'm going to share quite a bit of data from India that is actually going into these exercises. But these numbers are constantly changing, because that's the purpose of the global exercise, to sort of increase the awareness, increase the sensitivity, increase the knowledge base to keep on arriving at newer and newer methods to refine these numbers. The change in numbers is not necessarily a reflection on the change in the actual numbers of deaths and the numbers of morbidity headcounts that we are counting, but often a refinement in the methodological process itself. And one has to keep up with it to sort of really see what the trends are. So you can recognize household air pollution here between 2000 to 2019 is the data that is shown here. Some 54 million people are estimated to be not at risk for household air pollution exposures. You will see just in a minute, in just a few minutes, how that number is uncertain by a considerable amount, because you will recognize just by counting the number of people who are dependent on solid fuels alone does not tell you how many people are at risk from household fuel use, because it's not just them who are not exposed, but they may not be using household fuels, but they may be at risk from many others in the community who are using it. We are trying to get better on how to avoid this double counting, but we haven't really crossed the bridge fully yet. On the other hand, if you can see the, where India is, for example, you would have to look at the legend carefully. India is last but one, on the left panel in the bottom row. And India is, the third from the top in terms of increase in PM 2.5 exposure in the ambient environment. And and many of us have to sort of really wrap our heads around when we have a global community of researchers that includes substantial representation from the Indian community of researchers. And when this burden or the health burden is constantly changing, do we have to pay attention to the magnitude of the change? Do we have to pay attention to the direction of the change? Or do we have to prioritize intervention, recognizing that the burden is large, no matter which way and however you compute it? There are some pointers that tell you where you need to act, when you need to act, and how best can you act to achieve the most amount of efficiencies. If the changing phase of exposure is this big, the changing phase of health impacts. You saw just a moment ago, the category of health impacts I included in the burden from tobacco and air pollution. That included all but the last pie that is shown in the rightmost panel. The global burden of disease exercise and the India national and state level disease burden initiative is now including a whole new category of health impacts that associated with children who are either premature or low birth weight, resulting in neonatal and late neonatal as well as early neonatal deaths from air pollution. And because of the very high prevalence of low birth weight in India, suddenly these numbers have really jumped up despite the enormous decrease in the exposures attributable to household air pollution. So the primary takeaway from the global exercise that now includes India and very heavily includes contributions from India from primary empirical health studies, from primary empirical exposure studies, is that what should be the primary purpose of us utilizing, accessing, and interpreting this information? We have to use this information in conjunction with what we know from our experience of conducting research on air pollution and health in India. So let me just spend a few minutes sharing the evidence and the experience base from health effects studies conducted in India, and perhaps comment a little bit on where the priority gaps are and where, as early career researchers, as many of you are, could be the role for local, national, and global collaborations to facilitate clean air actions, whether it is LPG for the rural populations who are dependent on biomass, whether it is clean lighting for those who are dependent on kerosene, whether it is clean agricultural technologies to avoid agricultural burning, whether it is clean brick kilns or clean transportation. We all recognize and we have advanced considerably in actually being able to model or implement these scaled up technologies. Where could health play a role in facilitating these clean air actions? The first accomplishment that the Indian research community has made, I think, in order to be able to capture health effects, we need to have instrumentation that goes beyond collecting secondary data that is routinely collected for regulatory purposes, to be able to use such refined, highly, spatio-temporally resolved data on exposures to capture the exposure heterogeneity, whether it is the indoor environment, the outdoor environment, the school environment, the commuting environment, the work environment, whether it is a pregnant woman, whether it is a child, whether it is an older person. We have come a long way in developing, validating, and deploying field instrumentation to capture the exposure heterogeneity in India. Multiple studies have been published now to sort of really look at what is the range. Shown here is just a selection of instrumentation that my own group has been deploying in many of our cohort studies, but there are many, many groups out there in India who are using some combination of this or more. This is not by any means the whole set of instrumentation that we look. But it's very important to recognize that for the conduct of health effects studies, sometimes you have to be sort of really, really creative, not just about the health measurements. Just like you probably would not use routinely collected health data, you would want to nuance it with advanced methods. You don't want to be really relying on just secondary data. The second important accomplishment that the Indian research community has produced is in addressing health impacts of national relevance in prospective rural-urban cohorts. Again, shown here is a smattering of the list of the health outcomes and the collaborators that is being led by our team here, together with our collaborators. In particular, I want to note the collaboration of IIT Delhi and Public Health Foundation of India, along with many other collaborators in the US, but this is by no means the complete exhaustive list. But I wanted to point out that collectively, the research evidence in India has been able to generate evidence on impacts on health that is of relevance for national programs. Birth weight, child pneumonia, child growth and development, cardiovascular diseases, asthma, respiratory morbidity, to just name a few in prospective studies wherein we have been able to avoid the uncertainties and avoid the extrapolation risks of a large number of pooled studies when we sort of participate in global exercises of the kind that I opened my talk with. More importantly, we have now learned to inform implementation science and evaluation of clean technologies. Shown here are some of the efforts that my own group is leading for informing implementation science through the conduct of community-based randomized control trials involving LPG, through randomized control trials using economic instruments and LPG through conditional cash transfer, as well as informing monitoring and evaluation efforts for LPG coverage through intelligently and strategically designed ambient air quality monitoring efforts. Again, by no means an exhaustive list, but just a smattering of studies that my own group has been involved with, along with collaborators in India. Finally, the other important area where Indian research community has been able to make a great amount of progress is in launching biosurveillance, population-based surveillance using biological monitoring, using biomarkers of exposure, biomarkers of early biological effect, biomarkers of susceptibility, and shown here are just a few of the biological markers that now find an integral place in ongoing prospective cohort studies, as well as observational studies and in randomized control trials. And we have been very fortunate to be partnering up with several eminent Indian institutions, IIT Delhi and AIMS in particular, to sort of put the exposure and the biological monitoring pieces together. Here is a listing of recent cohort and multi-country studies beyond what our group has been involved in, but quite a few are coming or in the pipeline, and you will be seeing results from many of these if you have already not had a chance to look at any of them. Okay, so what have these studies collectively shown? The consistency of observed associations with the global pool of evidence on maternal and child health endpoints and CVD biomarkers over the rural-urban exposure continuums in India has been remarkable. We would have thought India is a country where the exposure configuration is so different. The source profiles are so different. The background incidence of disease conditions are so different. Is the risk of these health endpoints from air pollution really that different in India? The answer, fortunately is no, and unfortunately is also no, which means that the burden is likely to be as large as the global models are projecting. Fortunately, it is, that being same is also fortunate because now we can comfortably use the global evidence pool to start acting, to start intervening. But that would really require that we get better in the choice of exposure metrics. Currently, we are using very heterogeneous exposure metrics, so it is becoming very difficult to pool this evidence across the numerous studies that are going on in India. And therefore, there is a need to conduct a coordinated set of studies that will allow us to pool the results for these strategic health endpoints. There is also an expanding battery of pollutants. We need to get beyond PM 2.5. We have gotten to address carbon monoxide, black carbon, air toxics, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but we really need to sort of increase our focus. Maybe the impacts associated with PM 2.5 are comparable, but when you start speciating it, we probably are going to learn quite a bit more. We are also going to be needing much more focus on really quality control for the sophisticated instrumentation, the analysis that we are doing. We already have that in place for regulatory monitoring, but we really need to have benchmarked standards for exposure assessment, benchmark standards for biological monitoring, just like the way we have for health endpoints. When you're looking at air pollution and health, the health side often tends to be strong. It's not always possible to be as strong within an epidemiological study, but we know how to do health. But this logic of we know how to do exposure and biological monitoring with an equal amount of rigor. It's just that the capacities to do that is often not as widely available as it is to do health assessments. And many of the health, if there are health members of the health community attending, they will agree, they would sort of say, exposure to ho jayega, par health nahi hota hai, health bhi nahi hota hai, exposure bhi nahi hota hai, biomarker bhi nahi hota hai, if we are not all thinking that the primary purpose for this is air pollution and health. So we need to be sort of really pooling all of it. So therefore, as we stand at the threshold of the rollout, really ambitious rollout of the National Clean Air Program. Many of you in the audience are probably familiar with all the elements of the National Clean Air Program, including the sector-specific, sectoral interventions, rather sector-specific interventions that have been outlined. It is really important to sort of piggyback our health studies within the NCAP, take advantage of these natural experiments that are being thought of either as sectoral interventions as NCAP or are thought of as part of other ministries, but have an implication for NCAP. Let me just spend the next 5 minutes before I conclude on where such a strategic win-win opportunity might be. The strategic win-win opportunity, in my opinion, and the opinion of many of the Indian community of researchers who have been working on air pollution and health, is to recognize that household air pollution is not limited to the indoor rural environment alone. Nearly 7 studies, many of them are model studies, have shown that the contribution of household sources to ambient air pollution in the rural areas and in the air sheds of the urban areas that are in the vicinity of these sources is considerable, and the burden attributable to ambient air pollution from household sources ranges anywhere between 20 to 50% of the total burden attributable to all ambient. So you can recognize that shown here is a very elegant piece of study that Sagnik led along with his former student Saurangsu Chaudhary, which says that merely cutting down the household emissions would provide us with an opportunity to meet the national ambient air quality standards in virtually all but a few of the few of the districts in India. I won't go into explaining the visual, but if you can look at the visual and take away the message that all it would take to meet the national ambient air quality standard in most places in India is to eliminate household sources of solid fuel use for cooking. That is a huge, realization, but yet we have to sort of really verify that that is indeed the case as we mount strategies to eliminate household fuels. And eliminating of the household fuels is currently already household solid fuels is already happening in an ambitious pace thanks to the PMUY or the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, wherein access to LPG is being increased. But many of you who are in the field and those of you who are new to the field, please take it from us. Access to the LPG is all but the first step. Merely, putting down on paper that LPG is your primary source of household fuel does not result on the ground in actually bulk of the rural population being able to eliminate biomass. Using LPG quite a bit is one thing, but not using biomass has to be accomplished in an equal measure. In almost every sense of it, we need to be measuring how many people are not using biomass as opposed to measuring how many people are using clean fuels. Because you may be using clean fuels and it might take you nearly 10 years before you can give up the use of dirty fuels. And therefore, the PMUY program could be an excellent opportunity for us to sort of really piggyback on for air quality actions. And again, we have to sort of really recognize that pollution, air pollution in particular, does not recognize political or administrative boundaries. And to quote, the authors on this particular paper, it is like a water dispute in reverse. Downriver people want the water, but down side of the air pollution, recipients of air pollution don't want it. You don't want to be on the recipient side of things when your source is not, is principally within your airshed. So this, I want to conclude by saying that this is again a piece of work that Sagnik has been responsible for contributing, recognizing that there are airsheds in our country where we could easily focus on particular sources and mounting, strategic hybrid models of exposure monitoring that use alternative spatiotemporal scales, spatiotemporal resolutions, as well as alternative technologies, is really a very very strategic way of wrapping our heads around how can we think of the National Clean Air Program initiatives that have a life of their own. They are not going to wait till our health effect studies are going to be completed. But if we could sort of really piggyback onto the National Clean Air Program in strategic ways, the health research community can do a huge service to the national policies. And for true impact on the ground, I would quote my very close colleague Sharad, that there needs to be a healthy dialogue between those who create the information like us, those who distribute it like many of you who are attending it, and the decision makers. So may I implore the center directors at IIT Delhi, many of you who have held senior such roles for issues other than air pollution, could you guide us? Could you tell us where could we start for the most efficient near-term returns? Is there an existing scaffold to piggyback on? And what would resonate most with decision makers? We view this as a national responsibility given our capacities to create and sustain seamless breathing spaces that would ensure healthy air for everyone and everywhere, not just rural, not just urban, not just young, not just old, so that we can spare our lungs and make our lungs keep looking pink and staying in the pink of health forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for a fantastic talk. So we have few minutes for some questions. So already there are a few questions in the chat box, and I will first read out those questions. So Madam, one question is that how does one separate the impact of ambient air pollution from household air pollution? You mentioned, but if you can clarify more on that.
Yeah, it is a tough question. You know, we're all struggling. It is possible to do it, you know, by sort of, you know, if you're sort of really looking at, you know, prospective cohort studies, you can really parse out the exposures that are, you know, that can be attributed to the indoor and the outdoor microenvironment. And by piggybacking it onto our knowledge about sources and emissions and the attributable concentrations, it's not an easy task at all. But nevertheless, in many places in our prospective epidemiological studies, we have been able to attribute a fraction of the total exposures to household. And in this case, let me tell you, household air pollution, in this case, is a very specific framing. It is not all indoor air pollution. It is, you know, it is the air pollution that is attributable specifically to the use of solid biomass fuels. So in many instances, this separation is very clearly possible through exposure attribution for various sources. We'll be happy to share the methodology. It's still being tested. We are hoping that we will actually be able to separate it. We can actually separate it in small geographical areas. The goal is to scale it. The real challenge comes when we want to scale it at state and national levels.
Yeah. So, Madam, there are a few more questions, but mostly they're talking about your opinion on the community involvement in this whole exercise.
Yeah, I think, you know, especially with the advent of the low-cost sensor technology networks now, and the, you know, and the role of the community to work with scientific community to allow such monitoring to go on at hyper-local scales. One of the challenges what we have, you know, just like the previous question, household to ambient is one separation. But we also have, you know, very complex gradients in the proximity of very strong local sources. Near field sources, near field exposures are huge. And that may afford a huge opportunity for, you know, intervention. You don't have to scale it. All you have to know that, you know, these are exposures that are impacting only that particular community, only those two streets. And therefore, engaging the community has to trust this network of researchers so that we can actually deploy such instrumentation at scale and share that information And it is not easy to do that by just putting in a few monitors and just spewing out some numbers and just sensationalizing that these are the problem areas. We really need to sort of work with the community in actually identifying the sources, mitigating them, and seeing if that has actually made a difference for the community. So we would very much love the opportunity to strategize this, with some community organizations so that we can develop a model for community engagement for air quality action.
So, Madam, there is another question on use of biogas, particularly for those who cannot afford LPG.
Yeah.
So, is it a viable alternative? Yeah.
Yeah. Biogas certainly is a technology that will produce, exposures comparable to LPG. It will be as clean as LPG in terms of the microenvironment where biogas is being used. But there is a very long and rich history of exploring the feasibility of biogas as a scaled up alternative to LPG or other fossil fuels for the issue of household cooked fuel. And the short answer to that is biogas is not a viable proposition. Mainly because of the extreme logistics involved in actually generating biogas and piping biogas. And most importantly, you talk about community acceptance. If there is one domestic fuel that is universally accepted by nearly all of the 1.4 billion people, is LPG. So till such time LPG is good for you and me, we need to be saying LPG is good for the village folks too, not advocate things that are difficult to maintain, hard to sustain, and difficult to access. And that is my personal view, that it is about equity in the choice of fuels, not just technological evaluation of a particular type of fuel.
Yeah, so ma'am, there is another question on biomarkers. So the question is basically, what are the biomarkers that would explain that a person is exposed to air pollution, and also is it only the lungs which is getting affected due to the air pollution?
Excellent question. I so apologize for not emphasizing this. Lung is the point of entry. You just have one pair of lungs, but if your lungs fail, it is going to get everywhere else beyond the lung. That's why the lungs are so important, right? The lungs are pretty good for warding off. Their respiratory system is pretty good. But the more and more you insult the lung, more of it is going to get beyond the lungs. All of air pollution, bulk of the air pollution impacts are systemic. It's not just limited to the lungs. It is the common perception to think that lung is the site of injury. Lung is the site of injury, perhaps. Lung is the first site of deposition. But depending on what's deposited, you are going to run the risk of it getting everywhere in the body. And there are biomarkers of air pollution exposure. Some are very specific, some are non-specific. But I also saw a question in the chat box about evaluation of biomarkers of air pollution. And I will say this, the capacities to sort of really conduct biological monitoring for air pollution is quite limited. We have the capacities to conduct biological monitoring for a large number of things, but just like that, there are not too many labs that are really capable of validating this biomarker proposal. We'll be happy to share more information from our ICMR lab and the ICMR network about where those capacities are available and what help can be provided to them.
Yeah, so we'll take 3 more questions in the interest of time. So there is a question, ma'am, do you think risk perception towards air pollution as a threat also influence the individual actions? And do you think enough dialogue is happening amongst community to take action?
Risk perception, it's all about risk perception, right? If you don't perceive it as a risk, the risk is only as large as how you perceive it. And central to risk perception is risk communication. And what you're doing through the center is exactly to shape that perception. If you communicate about risks, objectively, scientifically, earnestly, the risk perception will be a trusted one. The perception may change, but it would be, something that was well informed. Therefore, risk perception is at the heart of risk management. Risk communication is enabled by the work of all of us scientists, but centers such as, CERCA are playing a phenomenal role in actually communicating these risks so that risk perception is shaped the right way.
Yeah, the next question is on the, so basically the question is that are there any specific data on the contribution of sources other than solid fuel burning for the indoor air pollution, like incense sticks, mosquito repellents, etc.?
Of course, like these are all sources that are well recognized and they are all also associated with health risks. But I only presented, risks from exposures for which we have data that can be scaled at state or national levels. Okay, so the state level disease burden initiative essentially looks at risks, and that's why only PM 2.5 was chosen, and only ambient concentrations of PM 2.5 are chosen, or environmental concentrations of PM 2.5 are chosen as a metric. Many sources of indoor air pollution are well known to be associated with health risks. Indoor air quality and maintenance of indoor environments is a well-established science. We are looking at something that is usually not within the regulated indoor environments. Domestic environments, including incense or other kinds of sources, mosquito coils, there is a whole lot of literature out there, and there is a need to study that as well. Incense, as we understand, may not be such a big source, but certainly something as ubiquitously used as mosquito coils needs to be explored more. There is some very interesting literature that is emerging, and science will tell us in a few years about substituting those sources as well.
So the last question from the chat is on EV. So Delhi actually has given a big push towards these electric vehicles. So the question is, do you agree these small steps can bring big changes? And also, are electric vehicles a good feasible alternative to coal in India?
Yeah, broadly, yes. There is no question about it. There can be some caveats. We have to be careful about it. But nevertheless, no matter whether electric is good or not, coal is bad. So there is no question about it from a health point of view. So we have to sort of really look at if we are going to reduce coal emissions from a health endpoint, and if electric mobility affords one piece of alternatives, you can clearly recognize as much as coal is bad, it's not easy to substitute coal out for health reasons very easily in India. But we have to recognize that there is a need to slowly phase it out from a health point of view. And therefore, that in itself is a good experimentation platform, and perhaps no other capital can actually experiment this at scale than the Delhi NCR, and there is a real need for doing that. And I also want to say efficiencies often in the transportation sector can really relieve the pressure on fossil fuels for some other sector. So therefore, it's important to look at co-benefits from all these initiatives that can spill over to other states, other sectors, and other uses. And definitely the physical activity thing has to be thought about. So the co-benefit is not just limited to exposures from air pollution, but other exposures that can impact health.
So there was a question asked by one of our PhD students in IIT Delhi about systematic capacity building, particularly for the young researchers, because I thought it's important, since we are launching CAFR. Yeah.
Yes, we do offer, an MPH program in occupational environmental health for those of you who are, not, ready to and game to acquire a full-time qualification that has a huge focus on air pollution epidemiology, as I understand. But yes, the COVID pandemic has taught us about how to expand our reach of educational programs like the way we never imagined. And our university administration is now convinced that we can actually teach to anyone and everyone in the country using technologies that do not require in-person attendance. So this is a huge opportunity. We would love to be collaborating with IIT Delhi and the center, our Center for Advanced Research on air quality, and CERCA could easily scope this, and we would be delighted to scope an annual calendar of events. We do offer several events, but they are not offered on an annual calendar basis. These are, events organized on a needs basis. Feel free to tell us what you're looking for. We can customize an annual calendar for the benefit of all of you.
So thank you, ma'am. Before we officially close the question and answer session, Mr. Dugal, if you have any comments or questions.
Thank you, Sagnik. And thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. This was most enlightening session. And really, you really focused on some of the most important things that CERCA needs to do. And your guidance and your inspiration in this area would be a leading light for CERCA. So I once again thank you and look forward to continued association with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I think we are already 7 minutes past the official time. So let us end today's session. So ma'am, it's a great privilege to hear always from you. And it was such a fantastic talk, summarizing the overall problem that the researchers are facing and what we need to do. So thank you again for agreeing at such a short notice. When we thought to start this seminar series, immediately I thought of you as to be the first speaker who can really kickstart this entire activity of CERCA. And I hope that we'll get more associations with you in future in various other activities, particularly the awareness, in addition to research, I mean to say. So thank you again for giving this fantastic talk at CERCA, and we look forward to interact with you more. So there are actually questions and requests if the presentations can be shared. So I will talk to you, and then for others, actually, we'll see actually how we can share these presentations with others. So with, yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Dugal, you want to say something?
No, I'm just going to say thank you. And we can close the session now.
Yeah, so yeah, with this actually, we formally close these sessions, and thank you everyone for attending this seminar series. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Bye.